So today we're here to talk about immersive environments and more so how we embed digital media into built environments. So what we've been seeing in the past, let's call it a decade. I don't have any specific numbers yet on that, but in terms of my experience looking at the past decade, how we've been seeing, the notion of a digital experience that we typically associate to a specific format, right? When we talk about a digital experience, still to this day, we think mobile application, tablet, your phone, a display that has a predefined size or shape. But what we're seeing a lot more of is how we're embedding these digital experiences within the built environments and how we're starting to apply digital media more and more. And you can see a lot of this in this trade show actually, where you see a lot of the displays that are taking, uncommon shapes. Actually, if you look at what LG did at their booth, is a pretty good example of that. It's not about a square, it's really about a digital display that takes a very specific shape. So my background really is in computer games initially, and over the past 10 years working with my team at Float4 to develop a lot of these experiences, both on the content side and more recently with our new venture, Real Motion, which is a technology company that develops a lot of the technologies that drive this. That's as much of a pitch as I'm going to give you about what we do. This is really about the industry in general, seeing what we've learned from it and sharing our knowledge about that. And this is absolutely a two-way conversation. So at any point, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll address it as we go on. Cool, first glitch. Can you switch to there we go. Okay, so this is actually how a lot of the conversations that we have with clients start. It typically starts around the idea of technology. We bought a really new cool screen, or we have a lot of pixels that we want to use for this installation, or we got the best technology, but we didn't really think about the experience. And then we get a call, and it's like, now we need content. Please do something with it. And that's the first thing that we look at when we look at a project. That's a big difference compared to the more traditional media platforms in terms of digital media, like television, where you have a very fixed format. You have a lot of things that are standardized. In our world, it's really not the same thing. So just looking at the standpoint of a display, it really doesn't do the job well. We need to look at the whole space and understand how the digital media lives within that space. When people walk into that room or into that lobby, what's the first thing that they see? How do you expect them to behave? Because it's, again, very different from a platform like a mobile phone, where the moment that you take it out of your pocket, you've already engaged with it. But if you walk into a space, people aren't necessarily aware of what the capabilities of that technology are, what the purpose of the installation is, right? So that's why we look at it from this standpoint a lot. It's, okay, but why? What's the purpose of this? And one of the ways that we actually very simply boil it down is we ask our clients, what do you want people to remember? Are you able to summarize that in a 20-word sentence, right? And if that's not clear, well, we do work with them so that we can all regroup around that answer of what we want people to remember. And then that's the guiding element that we go back to when we develop the rest of this experience, whether it's from purely the content, creative standpoint, but also the technology. Those two need to work hand in hand. It's not a sequential step of technology first and content after. They both have to evolve throughout the design portion of any project that we do. So one of the things that I've noticed over the past years is also how we have convergence in different fields that aren't necessarily or initially designed to work together or to bring benefits to the other field, but in the end they do. And to some extent, some call it convergence, others call it cross-pollination. 4 examples that I have here: real-time graphics. We come from the video game industry, so if you don't have real-time graphics in video games, you don't have a video game, right? So that's one of the first things that we saw when we started Float4 was all the technologies that we were using in video games, we realized that a lot of people in the AV industry weren't aware of. And we were really surprised when we saw that people weren't using graphics cards and doing all of their rendering on graphics cards, and how much it was just a different approach. So that's one of the first things that we saw as being an element that could contribute to another field, although its origin was for a completely different purpose, right? And these days we see with companies like NVIDIA, who's heavily invested in the use of GPUs, so graphics processors, for deep learning, we see now some benefits of what's generally known as AI, which can cover so many things these days. But in terms of graphical applications, if we see some of the new technologies that are coming out in terms of graphics cards, they're actually using some of these new capabilities of neural networks to have applications that are specific to graphics. So that's why these days we're getting closer, not quite there yet, but closer to having real-time ray tracing, which is a form of rendering that creates the most realistic images that we can create with a computer. And typically that would be something that would take a lot of time to do. So now we see it's on the horizon for it to be able to be added into our workflow so that we eliminate the time allocated to rendering, which is a huge cost if you do any type of digital media production. So it probably won't eliminate it across the whole spectrum, but it'll definitely bring a lot of benefits to people that work in that field. Display technologies, I mean, there's more than I can, that I have time to name in the 14 minutes that I have left, but if you just look around here, you see the vast volume of different types of technologies that are coming around. We see the cost of LED that's dropping down, and these days a lot of people are talking about the new micro LEDs that are being used. Projection is making a bit of a comeback with the laser light sources that make cost of operation a lot lower than what it used to be. So the display technologies are also making it a lot more affordable for people to integrate these types of experiences in their projects. Then we have sensors. So one of the things that I remember we did when we started Float 4 is we bought a really, really expensive 3D camera, right? The Kinect hadn't gotten out yet. We had only seen a couple of demos. We didn't know what the price was. And that sensor itself was $10,000. 2 years later, you could get pretty much the same thing for about $300, right? And so in terms of sensors these days, what we see is autonomous vehicles that have a huge need for all sorts of sensors. And because of the wide adoption of those sensors and the volume that it represents for the manufacturers, we see the prices going down. So one of the things that we're looking at, for example, is LiDARs, right? 3D LiDARs that are still relatively expensive to integrate those into the applications that we do because the costs are starting to get lower and lower because of the wider adoption that it has in an industry that's as large as the automobile industry. And then neural networks, basically what we refer to as AI a lot these days. So that's where we see a cross-pollination between real-time graphics and neural networks, because there's more and more applications that are specifically geared towards graphics applications for AI algorithms. And you can see a couple of examples here. If you go to the Christie booth, you'll see they have an example of, I think they call it ACG. I don't remember what that term means exactly, but what they do is that you can stylize videos in real time using something close to a neural network approach. I think Panasonic has another example in there that has a camera that looks at you and it recreates what the camera sees with the style of one of the great painters. So those are very, very basic examples, but if you see some of the stuff that's happening out there these days, you can almost recreate. You can take a picture of, let's say, a street in the summer and then tell the AI to apply a winter look to it. And where it gets creepy is that, well, not creepy, but where it gets too good is that you can't tell the difference. It's good to the point that you see how it's added the snow at the right spots, changed the colors just the right way, that it's really, really hard to tell the difference between the two. So there's a lot of graphic applications that we see from that standpoint that AI will enable, and especially in terms of real-time graphics. So all those things together, these four elements that we see converging together, are elements that we see as drivers for the adoption of these installations and these projects that we see more and more. So let's move on to that. Okay. So in terms of the types of contents, content is a very, very broad term, right? It can mean a lot of different things. We categorize it in three different buckets, if you will. So when we say interactive content, for us it means that there's a human involved, right? Interactive content is typically based on real time, right? Because you need to have that reactiveness on the content side to be able to create that interaction with your audience. We have generative content, which is real-time content, but that uses data. So it's not based on a human interaction, it uses data. The simplest example is to have content that reacts to weather, right? Generative content, though, is in the middle because sometimes we'll use algorithms to generate the content based on data, but it won't necessarily be displayed in real time. So we just use those algorithms to generate a fixed asset, which is the last category, pre-rendered, which means anything that goes from CG to things that have to do with live action, right? And so in between those three, that's where we look at what type of content is best for an installation. And to be frank, there's not one that will overtake all of the others. It's typically a combination of the three. So a few examples of some projects that we did on the interactive side. So interactions, the most straightforward approach is still touchscreens to this day. We see, and we have a lot of references to, for example, that movie that I think a lot of people have seen, Minority Report, where you have Tom Cruise moving like that. So that technology actually exists, but the thing is, even with Kinects, it's still something that has, from a technology standpoint, even if it's feasible, from a user experience, there's not a standard of interaction that's been established. And the reason why we still have so much use for touchscreens is that because so many people, and basically everybody that has a cell phone these days typically has a touchscreen cell phone, the interactions for touchscreen are already adopted by most people. So if you ask anybody, how do you zoom on a picture? The chances are they say you do a pinch. Or if you rotate, the chances are they say you do a rotation with your finger. But if you ask them the same question of how do you do that with a gesture-based system, you'll get a lot of different answers. And so for the types of installations that we do that a lot of times are in a public context, you don't want to have that learning curve. So even if from a technical feasibility standpoint it's possible, we won't recommend it because it won't benefit the user experience. And the goal of these projects is not to do a technical demo. It's to create an experience that people will remember, right? So that's an important thing to navigate with your clients when you see sometimes you lose track of the fact that because it's so hard to do technically and you've achieved that, but does it still make sense from a user experience standpoint? And that's ultimately what what'll create a good project. So these are another few examples of interactive-based installation. As you see, most of the time they're either used, and you rarely see them when you're talking about motion based on the body's motion. It's very rare that you'll see it used to drive an interaction where you navigate through menus, right? So typically what we do is that we'll layer interactions together. What that means is when somebody enters a space, right, they're not necessarily sure what a certain display can do. So we'll use a motion-based interaction just to let them know, that their presence will affect what's happening on the screen. And the idea with that is you want to create something that's very, very simple, where you don't get it wrong. Because another thing that people want to do in public is look stupid, right? You don't want to look like you're not doing it right. So by creating that first layer of interaction in a way that is based on visuals, you can get it wrong. It's simple. It's something that's joyful, that brings down the inhibition of going to the next step of interaction, which typically is touch, right? And so you want to layer those interactivities by having different ways of interacting with your installation. In terms of generative content, one of the things that we see more and more is that when you look at the typical model for digital media production, what it's based on, well, it's based on the platforms where it was born. On television, where it's 30-second slots, 2-minute slots. It's based on a fixed period of time. But when you bring digital media into a built environment, like architecture, for example, that we have in this case, that model doesn't apply as well anymore, because in some cases you don't want things to loop. They're not supposed to be there for 30 seconds or a minute. They're actually supposed to be there for a couple of hours. And as an audience, and as humans typically, we're very good at detecting when something loops. And the moment that you see it loop, that's when you see, okay, I've seen the whole thing, right? So that's where generative content comes into play. The parallel that I make a lot of times with generative content, it's a little bit like looking at clouds. You recognize the aesthetic, you know that it's a cloud, but it's never exactly the same shape. And that's why it grabs your attention, because our brains are somewhat geared to trying to recognize a shape in something that's somewhat familiar, but not quite exactly. So that's why generative content brings a really good added value in this context, because it creates a longer shelf life for content, right? And we're really just seeing the beginning of what's possible from that standpoint. So imagine a piece of content that you can look at for hours, and it has the same effect as looking at clouds in terms of capturing your attention, or even looking at a fire. You know how sometimes when you look at a fire, you sort of become mesmerized by it? That's the same idea. These are another few examples. Again, in the context of built environments, meaning things that are meant to stay there for a very, very long time, that's where generative comes into play. Another thing that it relies on is real-time technology, which also means that in some of these projects that I'm showing you here, what we did with the real-time aspect of it is it enables it to create workflows for content production that are less costly, because what we provide our clients is the ability to upload certain assets of content through a content management system, and we're going to talk about that in the last couple of minutes. But they don't need to know how to operate a platform like After Effects or a professional content creation tool. So it doesn't necessarily give you, what I'm saying, it's not replacing things like After Effects, but what it does give our clients is the ability to keep content fresh for a longer period of time, and then when they want to do a complete refresh of the foundation content, the things that are much harder to create, that's when they can rely on firms such as ours to create high-end content, right? So it's a balance between the two that you need to achieve. Then we have pre-rendered content, which you can see a lot of examples around here. And in our field, the biggest challenge that we have, especially when we start to talk about shapes, is that when we have a new project that starts, it's not based on a standard like you have in television, at a specific frame rate with a specific color gamut, and all those things that have been built over the years, in that industry. In our field, we need to look at everything from the beginning to make sure that the bit depth that we're going to be working with, works all the way through to the screen. The frame rates are the right ones. And also, when you start to work with shapes that are irregular, all the content production tools that we use these days are based on a rectangle, right? So one of the challenges that creates is that even, for example, if you have a shape that, let's use a cross as an example, right? So if you take a cross and you put it in a rectangle, you're going to have spaces that are empty. The problem is when you create your content, you still need to render those pixels, right? And so that brings on a cost that you need to take into account when you start to plan out your content production. So all of these little things added together are things that really make the notion of digital media in the physical space actually a lot different than what you typically have in terms of an approach for a television or the web or other platforms like that. So just going to go quickly through this. So in terms of interaction methods, we talked a little bit about this, and this is actually a really interesting comparison of our senses, right? And how we compare them to, for example, some known interfaces that we have with computers. So your sight obviously is the fastest sense that you have, right? It's comparable to an intranet speed. Your touch is probably as fast as a USB key, and if somebody wants to get technical, of USB 2.0, maybe 1.0, not the USB 3 kind. Then your hearing and your smell are kind of like a hard disk. Again, like the more traditional hard disks. But this basically gives you a sense of how your senses respond faster. So that's why we typically work with things that have to do with sound and with eyesight to get people's attention at first. And obviously touch is something that comes in later. But it's an interesting way to look at how fast you see, how fast you hear, and how that affects the way that you can design your experiences. So basically with this, there's a reason why we use sight and sound first and foremost. So I talked a little bit about the conventions that are the established conventions for interacting. If you ask anybody, how do you open a file with a mouse? I doubt that nobody knows the answer to that. But again, going to the other end of the spectrum, if you ask somebody how do you open a file using a gesture, who the hell knows? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. There's no conventions that have been established, right? So that's something that you need to take into account when you create those experiences, again, going from technical feasibility versus what makes a good experience, and they don't necessarily always live in the same space. So tactile, we talk about that. That's the most, still one of the most widely used, and still, there is something that our fingers have the ability to do, is that they're extremely precise. So I don't foresee, at least in the near future, a replacement for tactile interactions. Screens and sensors, we went through that. So in terms of what we see these days, I mean, if you haven't seen the LG installation, it's still very, very impressive. But really how we can create shapes with these screens, okay? And I'm going to have to go quickly through this one because there's a last one that's really important. And media servers, I'm going to get to the content management system. But can I get like 3 more? No? All right, sorry about that. Okay, but don't forget about 2 things. One, sound, okay? Just as we saw here, I've been presenting this with a visual support, but the importance of sound in an experience is not something that you have to leave at the very last minute. It's something that you really need to consider very early on. The second thing, don't forget about content management. When you're talking about a permanent installation, the date that you deliver that installation is the start of the life cycle. It's not the end of the project. It's the start of that project. So taking into account the importance of having a system that your clients can use based on the skill sets that they have internally. So that's one of the things that we sit down with our clients and we look at, okay, what kind of skill sets do you have internally? Is it PowerPoint, or is it, I can work on a full-blown digital media production suite? And based on that, that's how we then determine the requirements for a content management system that gives them the ability to schedule, update content, and in some cases, create some of their own content through the system that we develop. And that's all I can do for today. I apologize if we started a little earlier. I'm available if you guys want to ask a couple of questions. Do we do a question session? Do we have time for that? No? All right. But I'll be right back there if you have any questions, comments, or things you'd like to share. Thank you for your time.